We're living in a world today that just feels wrong, from our jobs to our schools, and for some folks even their churches. It's as if we've slipped into some kind of dystopian future where things have gone off the rails so badly that we don't recognize our world any longer. If you're like me, sometimes it makes you sit back and wonder if I'm the only one that sees these things or if you're crazy. Look, I'm guessing if you're here and you're listening to this podcast, it's because you're seeking answers. Today I have a conversation with somebody that I think will give you those answers and let you know it's just not you and that you're not crazy and that something is very, very wrong. Her name is Julie Behling. Julie is a mom and an author who served an LDS mission in Russia. After that, she attended university where she did her thesis on Christians in Soviet Russia. Julie then discovered some information that, quite frankly, is very disturbing. Julie has detailed and documented the communist infiltration into America's most trusted institutions, schools, and even our churches. Julie documents all of this in her book, Beneath Sheep's Clothing, and I can't recommend that book enough. Julie here breaks down what she saw on her mission in Russia, and then we discuss the infiltration of communist influence into America. Now, our first conversation only lasted an hour, and I was still left with a lot of questions, so she was gracious enough to come back on and do a part 2. So as soon as you're done here, head right back to the website and check out part 2. That's next on this episode of the Mormon Renegade Podcast. Because of your generosity last year, I was able to buy better audio equipment and software. I can't tell you how much it meant to me that not only did you spend your time here with me on the podcast, but also that you found enough value in what I'm doing that you donated the podcast to upgrade it. This year, I want to continue to grow. Now, I want to add video to the podcast to continue to help you, my guests, and myself connect better through the show. The other feature I'm working on for this podcast is something I have to remain vague about for now. But what I can say is that it's something that will help us better connect as fundamentalists and traditional LDS folks. Now, to get that equipment for the video content I want to do and to build the infrastructure for the other project with this podcast, donations would certainly be welcome. Or you can go to MormonRenegade.com, click that supply store button, and get some new swag. New stuff will be out soon as well. Now, if you can't afford to do either of those two things, I totally get it. Maybe just keep the podcast in your prayers that we'll be blessed with those resources. Again, thank you for everything you do as well as for listening to the podcast.
You're listening to the Mormon Renegade Podcast.
Well, Julie, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So, when I first heard about your book, I was super fascinated because public education has been something that I've talked about before here on the podcast and had people on. At what point did you decide you were going to start homeschooling your kids?
Well, I have one son and he's 8. And I kind of actually assumed I would homeschool him from the get-go before I even had him. I had him pretty late in life. But then being the only child, he did attend preschool, part-time preschool. And then I did end up, and I've been working this whole time. I did put him in a charter school for kindergarten. This was the 2019-2020 school year, which was interrupted. And once the mask mandates came down for the next school year, I was like, no, we're not doing this. I'm not masking my then 6-year-old. So I homeschooled him from that point. I put him in a charter school again for a while, but have recently pulled him out and probably will be doing homeschooling or some sort of alternative schooling from here on out. So
right on. So what was the impetus for the book?
Oh, okay. Well, my book, Beneath Sheep's Clothing, that's a kind of a long answer to that question. I served an LDS mission in Russia in the late 90s. And was there, just a few years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I really got up close and personal with post-communist life in Russia. And I met a lot of people who had been very negatively impacted by communism, people who'd spent time in the Gulag, people who'd been traumatized by the Stalinist era,
Whew.
a lot of elderly people with really a lot of trauma. And I came back from my mission and I ended up getting a dual master's at Florida State University, a dual master's in Russian language and literature and Russian and East European studies. And for my Russian and East European studies degree, I decided to write a thesis. And I just felt drawn towards researching the Christians, the underground Christians during the Soviet Union. And then I kind of honed in more as I began my research, what exactly that would look like. And my interest in that came from my mission, from coming across, well, first of all, out of the, I don't know, like 1,000 people or so that I asked if they believed in God in the course of my mission, I was very surprised that out of everyone I asked, there was only one person who said they were atheist. And I found that pretty shocking. Everyone was either, yes, I believe in God, or I'm open to believing in God and I'm searching. It was kind of a bit of a golden era in Russia.
Let me ask you this. How did that come about? Because if you read Marx, he's very clear that religion is the opium of the masses, right?
Right,
That
right.
that this idea of religion and a God is almost threatening to Marxism and Leninism, because they have this idea that the state was almost supposed to be God,
Yeah,
right?
not almost. The state was God,
Right.
and the leader of the state was God for sure. No, religion, especially Christianity, were some of the top um, enemies of communism, and that had to be taken out. What they found, so that in the early decades of the Soviet Union, especially in the right at the beginning of it, they did mass arrests of Christian clergy, tortures, executions, putting people in the prison camps, and it was a bloodbath. It was a bloodbath all around. And of course, they bombed churches. They demolished them. They sacked them. They took out all of it, especially the Orthodox churches with a lot of gold and like jewel encrusted icons. They sacked all of that. But what they found, but by World War II and during the most repressive years of Stalin, that there was actually enclaves of Christianity that were strengthening underground and that were gaining more and more strength, and they could not extinguish religion. And once the World War II ended and Stalin died, there was what they had, the thaw. They called it the thaw. And so some of the really repressive things that had happened, especially in the 30s and 40s, early 50s with Stalin, that kind of lifted, and they actually let a lot of people go from the Gulag early, and among those people were a lot of Christian clergy. And then there was a bit of a Christian and religious revival at that time in the mid 50s, 60s. And so, but the Soviet state kind of rearranged its tactics. And my master's thesis focused on the tactics, the anti-religious tactics from the end of World War II up until Perestroika, until the mid 80s, because it was a more sophisticated set of tactics. And instead of just a brute force, we're going to kill everyone or execute or imprison everyone, it was like, how can we do this more effectively? And so I really focused on what I discovered were the three main anti-religious tactics. And the first one was not really any secret, anti-religious propaganda combined with pro-communist propaganda in the schools, in the media, in all of the arts. Poetry had to endorse communism. They could not have poets that did not glorify communism. They could not have filmmakers that didn't glorify communism. There could be no sculptors or any musician or anything. Everything had to glorify communism and make fun of religion, Christianity, of course, being foremost among those. And the second tactic was, instead of keeping up their complete, just outright persecution of Christians, they backed off and they gave a lot of concessions, but there was one group that they continued to persecute very heavily. And these were fringe Christian groups that did not go along with the government. They did not register with the government because there was a cost to registering with the government. You basically would sign away different parts of your beliefs in order to register officially with the Soviet state. So the Christians that I studied that were the renegade Christians, the underground Baptists, underground Pentecostals, Seventh-day Adventists, and Jehovah's Witnesses, they were enemies of the state numero uno, and they had the mass state still after them all the way up through the mid 80s. The third tactic was a new one that they developed that's pretty chilling. Probably their most effective anti-religious tactic was infiltration of the churches. And they did this with KGB agents who posed as would-be clergy going into the seminaries and going in to lead all the churches and to control the churches from within. This was done.
You know, as you were describing that, it's kind of chilling, right? Because
Oh, yeah.
I think you can make a case that at least two of the three we're seeing right now today in the States.
No, all three.
All three.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know how the registering part would work, like you were saying.
Well, but the government controls of the church.
Right. And we saw that during COVID, right? When the government was able to say shut down the churches and everybody just shut down.
Mm-hmm.
That was spooky. That was, to me, the first time I can remember where a guaranteed right that Madison had made sure was there, right? Your
Mm-hmm.
First Amendment right.
Mm-hmm.
Right to conscience, that was compromised for the first time I can ever remember on a big scale. Mm-hmm. And what scared me is we just took it. Mm-hmm. Right? There wasn't an outcry.
Not
so when those folks are driven underground like that, do you think that Christianity still managed to spread, or do you think that they did contain it?
Well, I mean, both. Yeah, the Soviet state, there were millions of casualties. And of course, they did decimate the faith of many people. So one of the things that was really common when I was a missionary there was meeting people who talking about baptism, and they would say, oh yeah, my grandma baptized me in the woods. So a lot of little Russian grandmas would take their little grandchildren out into the woods and baptize them secretly, and would still transmit their faith to them. But they were most of these types of Christians were taught, they taught their kids that they had to pretend. They had to just go along with the script to keep out of trouble. So Jeez. There's a whole lot of that went on. The ones that were the really hardcore people, the ones I studied for my thesis, I mean, these people were super amazing. I mean, they risked life and limb on a regular basis. It was, breaking the law just to have like a public baptism, or, to have, teaching their kids to pray. There were some groups, some of the underground Pentecostals in particular, that the state would just revoke their parental rights and take their children and put them in state orphanages, saying, well, you're abusing your child by teaching them to pray, so we're going to take your kids for their own protection. And of course, try to brainwash them.
So that was kind of the impetus for writing the book. Did you start seeing these things creeping into public education, and that was kind of what really led you to go for it?
It didn't start with public education. I wrote most of this book. Well, the first part of my book, again, Beneath Sheep's Clothing is the name of it. The subtitle is The Communist Takeover of Culture in the USSR and Parallels in Today's America. I didn't have my son. I had actually written most of this book before I even had my son. So I was not really focused on the education part of it. That came later. What actually caught my attention, interestingly enough, was in 2008, when the FLDS had El Dorado Ranch raided by the government, and had their children taken without due process.
Yeah.
That was like this looks just like what the Soviets did to the Pentecostals.
Yeah.
And then I started looking more deeply, and I'm not a fan of Warren Jeffs, and from what you said earlier, you're not such a big fan of his either, but there's definitely some issues there. But that doesn't mean the government can just go in and just take over and not go through the proper legal channels and the proper due process and everything. So I started looking more deeply, and I found all three of the tactics, the anti-religious tactics that I studied in my thesis. I saw them not just like a little bit, but like I saw it was just, it was bad. And it only got worse. It only got worse the more time has gone on. It's gotten exponentially worse, especially with well, it's gotten exponentially worse. We haven't seen the government come against another church since 2008 in the same way that, was big on the news. But I predict that we will, if there are churches and groups of Christians who defy the government. I predict that we will see such things increase.
That is so spooky. And you're right as far as the FLDS. And what's interesting is that if you look at the history of the FLDS, and I hope I'm getting the name right. I might be wrong, but I believe the man's name was Leroy Johnson. I might be wrong, but he was the original leader of the FLDS church. And this was back in like the 40s and the 50s. And for all intents and purposes, he was a pretty decent guy, right? He wasn't rearranging families. He wasn't doing anything like that. And so what you have is, once the Short Creek raids started to happen, it forced those people underground. And
Yes.
whenever you force a people into the shadows, you set them up for one of two things. One is constant distrust and maybe turn them a little bit militant, which didn't necessarily happen this time.
Right.
Or you set them up to become victims of a tyrant.
Absolutely.
And that's what the Short Creek raids really did, because it allowed the Jeff's family to come in there, starting with Warren's dad, to come in there and say, look, they really are after you. So you listen to me and I'm going to keep you safe. And when that happens, it's brutal. It's absolutely brutal. Anytime you force a church, a people, a subculture into the shadows, one of two things is going to happen every time.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely.
And so I find it's interesting that the government creates the problem essentially, and then has to try to fix the problem, only they once again just violate all sorts of constitutional rights in getting it done.
The other big example of the government going after a fringe religious organization, which is even worse than the 2008 one, was the Branch Davidians of Waco, 1993. And I was graduating from high school. I was like in my final month of high school when that happened. And so I just believed whatever I saw on the news. But when I delved into that, I would say out of everything I researched, the treatment of the Branch Davidians and what happened there, we don't know everything, but what we do know is horrific. It is absolutely one of the worst things I've ever researched.
And I'm guessing I was a sophomore in high school when that was going down. And what I remember most is I kept asking the question, well, what did they do wrong? Right? What was it that was going on that caused the government to show up in the first place? I was young, and I wasn't raised Mormon of any stripe, so I was a troublemaker. So I understood you could get away with a lot as long as you weren't raising eyebrows, right? So I was always like, what was it that those folks did that caused the eyebrows to raise? And I've heard things like they were amassing weapons or something like that. But it seems to be a pretty weak argument to show up with the amount of force that they did. Yeah. And you can correct me here, but I'm going to say this: both Ruby Ridge and the Branch Davidian debacle happened under the same administration, the same party. And you got to ask them, what's that?
I think Ruby Ridge. So
was Ruby Ridge Bush?
I think it was, because the Branch Davidian, Clinton had just been inaugurated like the month before, like month and a half before the raid on the Branch Davidians. So Ruby Ridge must have happened before that, but it was the same it was the same ATF leadership. Then, and from what I've researched, under Clinton, they did get additional funding, and they kind of wanted to show the new president, this was only part of the puzzle, that they were going to be doing a lot of great things protecting America, and so they needed to put on a big show to even lobby for more funding. That's one aspect of it, but there's other clues that I can't prove, but there's other clues that, let's just say that Bill and Hillary Clinton may have been putting this show on to try to scare religious organizations into compliance. There's evidence for that. I can't prove it, but there's evidence for it. And not just them, other players in the government as well. So
as you researched your book and you started to put the pieces together, how far along that revolutionary road are we?
the thing is, nobody knows exactly how things are going to unfold. I mean, we're pretty far gone, but a mass awakening of people and mass people standing up and awakening to what's really going on could, I think, prevent some of the worst plots from, unfolding completely. But we're not going to escape some crazy times.
Right. When I watched the riots happen, I believe it was the summer of 2020, after George Floyd was killed, and that was horrible, right? I'll never say that was right or whatever, but you could tell that a lot of the riots that were happening weren't necessarily grassroots.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. These had been
orchestrated.
They'd been orchestrated. Thank you. Yeah, you're exactly right. And if you read Marx and you understand that conflict has to exist before communism can take root, and you heard some of the things that they were saying, it was really spooky. And that caused me to go look at Black Lives Matter Inc. and look at just the website, right? And so I get on there, and the first thing they talk about is that they want to disrupt the nuclear family, going back to what Hillary Clinton had said about, it takes a village sort of a thing. But if you, again, go back to Marx, you can see the seeds, right? Because Marx was all about the idea of getting rid of the bourgeois family, that it needed to go away, and that those kids were the property of the state, not the parents. The other thing that I discovered is that the actual founder was a trained Marxist. She admitted it. So it was really spooky to see it, because I really came of age. I can remember when the wall fell, which was really the USSR hadn't completely fallen yet, but that was kind of like, oh no, they're done, right? This is the death throes. And so it was weird for me to have to look at all this and go, okay, it didn't die. It just changed. They just took off a military uniform and put something else on.
Well, when it gets even, when you look further into the roots of communism in America, you see that this is probably one of the most controversial parts of my book, but it's probably not going to be controversial to you or your audience. You look back at the roots of, let's say, infiltrating America's churches with communists, which was done beginning well over 100 years ago, infiltrating the school, as public school was being developed, pushing it in with socialism and communism. This was funded by like the Rockefeller Foundation, Carnegie Foundation, and guess who funded the Russian Revolution and funded Lenin? It was the same people. It's monopolistic capitalists from America. I think there were some maybe from Germany that helped fund it too, but they're the same people. They began infiltrating things here, organizations here in America, with communism and funding Lenin in the Soviet Union.
So let me ask you this, Julie, because I'm always fascinated with this, and I don't doubt you for a minute, because I've seen a lot of evidence that points to that, but I haven't been able to make sense of it. Communism at its core is really anti-capitalistic. You can make an argument they dig state capitalism, but even that, I mean, a true blue, well-taught Marxist strives for this global takeover, right? That the revolution has to sweep the globe in order for it to be truly successful.
Right.
Why would folks like the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, those sorts of people, why would they throw their lot in with them? Because they made their money from a capitalist system. What was the draw to get the Rockefellers and the Carnegies to jump into that?
Well, they made their money over there too, because Russia was just beginning to industrialize. And so they were able to go and make money off of the industrialization of Russia. And that's one thing. Number two, it's all about control. And these people, they're not true capitalists. They're monopolistic capitalists. They want to keep themselves and their family lines at the top of the heap. Communism is a handy control grid to keep the rest of the masses down.
Sure. No, that makes perfect sense. Another question I got for you, and I feel like this is really important, especially for some of my LDS listeners.
Mm-hmm.
How, when you talk about infiltrating the churches, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think we can see that, right, with the church that like Barack Obama attended and and Oprah Winfrey attended, where Jeremiah Wright, I believe his name is.
Yes.
You can go Google him and find all sorts of just horrible things he said.
Yeah.
When you say infiltrate, are you talking about they actively place, for lack of a better word, operatives in the pews, or are they banking on this idea of culture, re-educating the younger generation, and then the younger generation unknowingly does the infiltrating in the churches for those in power?
All of the above, all of the above, and infiltrating at the top leadership levels. Now, I will say this, out of the major churches in America, there is less evidence of communist infiltration into the LDS church than there is into any of the others.
That's good to know.
So, but there still is. More recently, it's getting problematic. But so when I'm talking infiltration of America's churches, what I mean is that on paper, it's all there, the evidence that by mid-century, mid-20th century, upwards of half of America's mainline Christian churches were infiltrated at the top. And so what Rockefeller, what he did is he funded different operatives to go into the seminaries and then become heads of seminaries and then be training the pastors, especially for the was called, first it was called the Federal Council of Churches, and then it changed its name to the National Council of Churches because it started getting a bad rap because people saw that they were being infiltrated at the time it was happening. And what these operatives did is they went in and they started changing doctrines, and they started casting doubt on the divinity of Jesus. Now, that's fine if you have doubt in the divinity of Jesus, but that's a little strange for a Christian pastor to cast doubt on the divinity of Jesus.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe you're in the wrong profession if you don't believe in the divinity of Jesus. Don't be a Christian pastor. But they began preaching from the pulpits, casting doubt on the virgin birth, casting doubt on Jesus as a savior. Jesus was just a prophet. He was just a good person. And then what they switched, they did a little switcheroo. Instead of having the focus, as far as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, the kernel of Christianity is that mankind has fallen and God sent Jesus to atone for the sins of mankind. We can turn ourselves over to Jesus, become one with him, and we can be saved, right?
Right.
Is that,
that's a pretty good encapsulation of, I would say, just about all Christianity.
That is the kernel of Christianity. What these operatives did is they went in there, and instead of making it about an individual relationship with God and about redemption from sin, it became a social justice gospel. They peeled away the aspect of Christianity where we are supposed to do service to those in need, absolutely, but they peeled that away from the relationship with God aspect, discarded the relationship with God, or at least the focus on it, and now the focus is social justice. And of course, we need people in this world who care about the downtrodden. It's essential. And you can see how easy it would be to play that switcheroo game. So now it's gotten, much more apparent by now. But even by the mid-50s, they had half of mainline Christian churches in America bamboozled with this. And then even by the 60s, you'd see the National Council of Churches putting out pamphlets for teenagers, trying to strip away at the principle of chastity and encouraging teenagers that it's okay to go and play around and see what you like. You would expect that from certain organizations, but not from an organization representing half of America's Christian churches. And there's more. Then you get into the Black liberation theology, which you mentioned, Jeremiah Wright. Liberation theology, that's how communism spread in Latin America, in like Colombia and those different places. They used Catholic priests. They trained Catholic priests to be Marxist operatives, to go in and rally up the peasantry to turn against, and of course the peasants in Latin America were highly oppressed. It's not hard to find oppressed people in the history of the world. So it's very brilliant, Marx's whole plan. Find some oppressed people, rile them up to anger against their oppressor, and get them to tear down society. Then the Marxists will come in and take power. And then, everyone gets to still be oppressed. Yay. But liberation theology in Latin America came out just a little before Black liberation theology. And all the evidence points to Black liberation theology in America being a KGB operation. And what's really interesting, and I haven't seen anyone mention this anywhere, I discovered this in my research, that the guy who he's credited with founding Black liberation theology, which for anyone who's not familiar, it puts this, it was before wokeism became big, but it puts the plight of Black people being oppressed and white people being the oppressors at the heart of the Christian message. It's like this marriage between Christianity and a struggle for preeminence, or just a struggle for to reduce oppression amongst Black people. You can see how they could be tricked, because obviously Black people have been oppressed throughout history in America. Anyways, but the man who was credited with founding Black liberation theology, Reverend Cone, he says that it was this white couple, Boyack, I can't remember their first names. Their last names were Boyack, that they were this head of this Methodist seminary in like Iowa or someplace where he was studying, and they gave him the idea and they encouraged him to come up with this new theory. Well, I looked into this couple, and I have to look at their names really quick. Oops.
No, you're good.
Guess where they came after they I think they're KGB operatives. Guess after they got this guy to come up with Black liberation theology to infiltrate the Christian churches for so many of Black Americans, they came to Salt Lake City, Utah, and they became movers and shakers in the Christian realm, not the LDS, but the Christian societies in Salt Lake City. And in fact, they became high up in Westminster College.
Wow.
In Salt Lake. One of them was the dean of students. They're both passed away. One of them was the dean of admissions or something. And anyways, they won all these awards for their work. And how much do you want to bet they were tearing down aspects of true Christianity in Salt Lake and promoting Marxism instead?
Yeah,
I don't know that full story.
I don't doubt it for a minute. And going back to the whole social justice thing.
Yeah.
I remember when that started to really, when I first caught wind of this, I want to say it was probably midway through Obama's second term, and it became a buzzword, right? Social justice. And you start peeling back the layers, especially within a religious context, because at first, from a religious context, you're like, well, I guess I can see that to a degree, right? We do, as Christians, we are commissioned to go and relieve the suffering of others.
Yeah.
So I can see that. But then what got me is it moved from a salvation comes to a person based on a relationship between you and deity, in this case, Christ, right? Where you would be like, I accept him as my savior. I'm going to throw all, I'm going to rely on his atonement. And it became more of this quasi-spiritualistic, pardon the expression, bastardization between organized religion and a communist effort, because there was this idea of we can't be saved unless we're all saved. And in order to get there, we have to do certain things within the churches, almost like what you'd see on a national communistic front. It was really spooky when I started putting those pieces together.
Yeah.
So today, we don't see as much, you said, in the LDS church, which I am so glad for. Do you think that that's maybe an outgrowth of I was sitting here thinking about it. One is that I can't think of another religion that claims the founding documents of the United States, things like the Declaration, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, were divinely inspired. I mean, darn near scripture.
Right.
And then the other is that you had the administration of Ezra Taft Benson during the, what was it, late 70s, early 80s, if I'm not mistaken, as the, that was before my time as being a Mormon. So I'm trying
up until the early 90s.
Early 90s. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Do you think that's why the LDS Church has been able to escape some of that? Was just because of that's left over?
Yes, I do. But there's a problem. So I wrote most of my book in 2009 through 2011. And then I just couldn't finish it. And then I pulled it out in the summer of 2021. I was like, it's now or never. I've got to finish this book. And then I caught I had to catch it up to modern day. And boy, things have gotten way worse with education. Things have gotten way worse with the churches. And what we've seen in more recent years is we've seen, because to the time that I'd written the book by 2011, I thought it's just half of the America's churches that are infiltrated with communism. But where we're at now, the evangelical churches have been hardcore infiltrated at this point from the top. The adherents are like, what is going on here? No, but from the top, they've been infiltrated. And we see signs of infiltration of wokeism, which is wokeism is neo-Marxism. In the LDS at BYU, there's professors at BYU that teach, the gender fluidity, and that they teach against the binary genders, which that is gender theory, which is part of woke neo-Marxism, with the whole point to destroy the binary genders, because the binary genders are supposedly a relic of oppression. But anyway, so we do see infiltration now. And is that from the top, or is that from whatever? I probably, maybe not the top, but it is spreading like a virus throughout society. It's within, there is some evidence that some leaders have kind of tiptoed into that direction. And people really need to understand what that is, and that's a whole other can of worms, the gender theory, the queer theory of Marxism, and then the whole gay agenda. And then, yes, we get to be loving and respectful of all people. And how do we balance all of that? But once you understand that the agenda is a Marxist agenda to tear down the family, to tear down the binary genders, and to create as much chaos as possible in society, then you can see how that agenda operates. And we probably don't have time to go into all of that. But there's a lot of information out there. I do go into it in my book as well. But we have to separate that agenda from the people who are gay or are whatever, and have love and respect. There's a seat at the table in society for everyone, whether you're gay or straight, whether you're whatever you are. Everybody gets to participate in our society, and everyone is worthy of respect. But we don't need to let our worry of being seen as judgmental keep us from speaking out against pornography in school libraries, which is rampant through Utah. Let me just tell you one quick story. I was talking with one of my closest friends. I live in Hurricane down in Washington County. It's one of the most conservative towns. It's a very highly conservative town. It's a hotbed. I would say it's a hotbed of conservatism here. We have one high school. One of my good friends, her daughter is a senior there. She said her daughter performed at Hurricane High's talent show a couple of weeks ago. And right before she went on, I guess she was singing, a kid came on stage and came out of the closet and then did a drag show. And then the whole school was on their feet, roaring with clapping and cheering. And, I don't want any gay child to be oppressed or, anyone to make fun of them, but to cheer on a drag show, that's going a bit far. At a drag show at a public school, I think we've gone a little bit too far there. And this isn't a hotbed of conservatism, that's what the kids are doing. So.
Whew. And I'm like you, right? I don't want anybody to have to live in the shadows. I think I've pointed that out before. That's
Yeah.
a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
At the same time, I feel like those matters need to be reserved for home, right?
Right. So, but
Or
they're
at
not.
least an adult setting, not a
Yes.
not a school talent show, right? And
Right.
that's where I have major concerns. My other concern is that it appears to me, and this I'll probably get a strike on YouTube for this, and that's okay too. But it appears to me like a lot of this seems to be the in vogue thing now, right?
Oh, yeah.
Where um kids are saying that they're trans or whatever,
Yeah.
but they're lauded, right? And when you start talking about victimization seems to be the new social capital upon which our society is operating, the best thing you can do for your own social standing at that point is to become a member of the oppressed class, right? And then we
Exactly.
harken back to Marx and we start talking about opposition versus the bourgeoisie who has it, has the power or that sort of thing, and it just foments more and more conflict, which is exactly what Marxism aims for.
Yeah. Yeah. This gender theory and queer theory, where they're queering our children with the social and emotional learning, and they can do it in any number of ways. They can teach, and I am a firm believer, and there's a lot of evidence for this, that there are operatives in schools. And honestly, Utah has been a prime target for this, because in Utah, yes, we traditionally are a very conservative state, but we're also very and trusting and respectful of authority. And so there's a lot of evidence. I'm not the only one saying this, that Utah has been a special little guinea pig to see how far they can push it. In fact, a friend of mine says that the wife of our Governor Cox had, in an email, had said that her goal was to push Utah as far as close to California with its education as possible, as
Oh,
much as to get away with in Utah. But in any case, what they're doing is the kids. So, there's the critical race theory where
mm-hmm.
the oppressed. So Marxism is all about oppressor versus oppressed. The oppressed class with critical race theory is people of color. The oppressor class is not just white people, not just white supremacists, but whiteness. Whatever
Right.
whiteness is, anything can be made to be a relic of whiteness, including a constitution. And so the kids, then, they do these like different exercises, these different privilege exercises, and the kids with more privilege that are Christian, white, heterosexual, they're made to feel guilty. And then the way that they can atone for their sins of privilege is to either become part of the oppressed class or become an ally. But it's even better to become part of the oppressed class. And if you can pick from like 6 different genders and sexualities, listen, one of my best friends has 7 kids, and her family, she and her husband got divorced a couple of years ago, and there was a bit of upheaval for her kids. And now she has 2 of her kids are somewhere on the queer spectrum. And that's not how they were raised. And honestly, I doubt that that's organic. I really think that that is. James Lindsay is a great anti-communist for people to research, and he calls the SEL, social emotional learning training, that's especially hardcore for high school and middle schoolers. He calls it cult grooming in the classroom, and the religion of choice is the woke neo-Marxism.
Well, and I think you hit on another thing. I do think that the Marxists learned, and I think they learned that mankind naturally seeks out religion.
Yes. Yeah.
Whether we want to admit it or not, mankind naturally seeks out a religious structure. Always has,
Yeah.
always will.
Yeah.
And so I think the Marxists got smart in the sense of, okay, we need to try to feed the souls of these people something that resembles that. Because if
Yes.
you look at what's going on now, and you described it perfectly. My daughter, who came home from college one semester, had the book White Fragility by
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
she was forced to read. And I remember I was
Bobby
like,
D'Angelo. Yeah.
yes, I was like, give me that book. Right. And so I started looking at it, and And I was like, you've got to be kidding me. Because what it described, and you laid it out here really well, Julie, is it's almost a repentance process,
Yeah.
right? Where you recognize if you're a white heterosexual individual, that is your sin,
Yeah.
right? And even
Right.
though you may not be able to, quote, overcome your sin in this instant, you should still go through these repentance steps process where you ask for forgiveness. And then maybe if you're lucky, you can then find yourself in one of those oppressor classes. So this is very much a religion. It's not a religion we would recognize per se, because the savior in this aspect seems to be society / the state. And
Yeah.
so as you can gain social cred in that way, it feeds into this whole religious feel to this thing.
Hmm. Yeah, most definitely. And I have some friends, like one of my best friends works with an organization in Salt Lake that serves the homeless. And she finds herself around a lot of like woke people and social justice people. And so she's confused. And I'm like telling her, look, here's how you can tell whether you're doing service to humanity or you've gone in the woke direction. Are you trying to tear some aspect of society down, or are you just trying to help people? If you're just
Right.
trying to help people, she's going and helping homeless people. Is she trying to like destroy part of society? No, she's not. She's not gone too far. But what they take, this good impulse that so many of us have to help other people and want to help the underprivileged, if then we then take that to hurl bricks at the courthouse and, you know, take a bike lock to someone's head, or want to destroy, different aspects of society in a very violent way, then you might be going in the direction of woke Marxism.
Right.
So,
Right. As I've watched this all unfold, and I've watched how it's instituted, how it's infiltrated public education, it's absolutely frightening.
yeah.
So I've said this before on the podcast. I'm a huge fan of the founders of the country, the founding fathers. I moved back to Maryland for 5 years just so I could be closer to the history.
Wow.
Um, and what scared me the most is when I had my oldest son was a sophomore, and he came home, and I remember we were just sitting around the table eating dinner, and he looked at my picture of Washington praying at Valley Forge, and he's like, "Did you know he was a white rich slave owner?" And I just kind of dropped my fork. I'm like, "Where the hell did you hear that? And why in my house are you saying that?" And I mean, we had long conversations just to try to get that removed, because
You program him.
they absolutely did. And when I see how well they've done it, my fear is that what they did to the founders in education, they're now doing to Mormonism in particular now, right? Because there's this
Yeah.
new movement within Mormonism where it's like, well, you know, there's certain parts of Mormonism that's redefining who Joseph Smith was, and then out and outright calling Brigham Young an usurper and those sorts of things. And it's
Mhm.
really the same tactic that they used with the founders, right, of the country, is that if you can discredit the founder or the early progenitor, I guess, of that idea, you can discredit the idea. And
Yeah.
so what they did with the founders, I think, is now underway
Yeah.
across Mormonism spectrum, right?
Yeah.
Mainstream LDS and fundamentalists alike. And I've said for a while, all our kids are on the chopping block at this point.
Yeah.
They're doing the same thing. I also agree with you that Utah is a special case for them. I
Yeah.
think Utah and Texas, I feel like I think there's this feeling of if we can get it done in those two states, we can get it done anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. And back to what you said about attacks against the LDS church. I'm not currently active in the LDS church, but I'm very LDS friendly, and I still share the foundational truths. So I feel very close to the LDS church still. But what I believe, just from my research and just from this whole pattern of everything, I think they hold the churches hostage. I'll just say in general, the churches are held hostage And churches that will defy the government, they'll cut off a finger, they'll whatever. And I see these things more and more in the news against the LDS Church. What we need to do is we need to get the word out to all, like you said, the LDS spectrum. We should expect mass disclosure of ill deeds from leaders, whether they're real or not, I don't know. But we should expect that, and that's a good sign. That means that the leaders of the church are actually standing up to the government. If we don't see that, that's when you have to worry, because that means that the LDS Church, will just go with the LDS Church at this moment, is capitulating to the government. I believe that any church in the next coming years that doesn't capitulate and go full woke or fully allow, or much more than currently, allow the infiltration of these Marxist ideologies to proliferate through their churches. Any church that doesn't do that, especially a major church, is going to be massively lambasted. And they will mostly do it through propaganda. If there's a small church that is a special threat for whatever reason, then they could get the Branch Davidian FLDS treatment. LDS Church is so large, they probably wouldn't be able to get away with that. This is one little thing. In the Soviet Union, they focused their heavy hand on the churches that no one liked. No one liked the Baptists or the Pentecostals or the Seventh-day Adventists or Jehovah's Witnesses. They were all considered cults in Russia because they were not Orthodox. So they were very easy targets. In America, Branch Davidians were made to be easy targets. A lot of what was said about them was not true. Some of it was true. Same thing with FLDS, easy targets. Some of what they've been accused of is true, some of it not. But with the LDS Church, they'll put out more and more dirt on different leaders, present, past, whatever. And again, whether it's true or not, I don't know. But we should expect that, and we should actually tell the church, hey, we would rather that they come out with smear campaigns every single day and you stand up to them than to capitulate and not have those smear campaigns. And we just need to become immune to the smear campaigns, and maybe some of them will be true and we can research that for ourselves, but we're going to need to be able to have our heads on straight and be able to also realize that Jesus himself said that there would be wolves in sheep's clothing. Every church is going to have some really bad apples in high positions at different times. The Catholic Church, there's been you can see some bad apples going on there throughout history. So, and the LDS Church is not going to be immune. Any church, any major church, I 100% promise you this. This is one of the main things I came away with for my thesis and my book. Any major church of influence is a major target for infiltration. How deeply it's infiltrated, that's a question, but it will be any major church that is a big influence for good is going to be a major target. And they've been in this game for over 100 years working to infiltrate. There's no way that there haven't been some operatives placed within the LDS Church. That would be impossible. And I will say one other thing that I discovered an article showing that the Communist Party USA, this was in the 30s, I believe, the 1930s, they actually recruited their members. These were people who were no longer Christian. They were Communist Party members. They asked them to go back into their churches of origin and pose as, oh, I'm back. But then behind the scenes, try to, do some funny business. And there was one of the people that was showcased in the article was Mormon. And I just don't know what he was able to accomplish. I don't have that information. I don't know if anyone does. But we have to assume Jesus said there's the wheat and the tares, there's the wolves in sheep's clothing. Every church is going to be infiltrated, and we just have to look for the signs of that and just keep our heads on straight. And we need to have our focus, our relationship with God first and foremost, and not in any one person or body of people that we call leaders.
Sure. Great stuff. Okay. I know we said we had to keep this to an hour today. So real quick, let's plug the book again and tell people where they can find it.
Sure. You can grab my book, Beneath Sheep's Clothing. Again, the communist takeover of culture in the USSR and parallels in today's America. It's on Amazon. You can also go to my website, beneathsheepsclothing.com. I do have where you can get the first couple chapters of the book for free. I also am in the end stages of putting together 3 homeschool lessons for parents, whether you homeschool or not. These are for teenagers. And it's all the information that is crucial, that I believe is crucial for teens to understand about freedom and tyranny. The first lesson is available for free on my website right now. It's called Why Does Freedom Matter? The second one is The Anatomy of Tyranny, and it goes through in some of the main ways that you can tell that there's a tyranny, censorship, different things like that. The third one is The Ideology of Wokeism. It's a 2-part lesson. I'm still hammering out a few little details on that. And then the last thing, I'm actually working with a documentary filmmaker, and we're making a documentary with this content on my book.
That's awesome.
Yeah, the trailer of the documentary, he's working on it, and then we'll be doing fundraising. If there's anyone who wants to contribute or knows someone who might want to help fund a work like this, really a wake-up call to America's Christians, America's parents with kids in school, and just patriots in general, you can shoot me an email at beneathsheepsclothing@gmail.com, and we're going to be hopefully getting this documentary completed this year.
That's awesome. I will. I'll put that information in the episode page notes, and people can go there and definitely donate to it, because I feel like it's worth it. All right, Julie, anything else you want to say in conclusion?
Yeah, I do. I want to say one more thing. When I wrote my master's thesis, the biggest takeaway I had, I looked at the different tactics of the different Christians and different religious organizations and how their survival tactics and which ones were most associated with success and failure of those groups. And what I discovered, the underground Pentecostals were the most successful, and they were also the most decentralized. The churches that had more highly centralized leadership, once those leadership was infiltrated, like the Seventh-day Adventists that I studied, they were very highly centralized. And once the top leadership was breached, it was game over for them. But with the Pentecostals, their philosophy was what they called the priesthood of the believer, that individuals could connect with God to know what their calling was, their function within the church and just in society. And they encouraged people to, oh, you feel called to go preach in this city? Go for it. You feel called to do this? Great. So the centralized leaders were much less prominent. The people were more empowered to have that connection with God, and therefore when they would have different leaders of the church would be arrested, the church would function just as normal. It didn't impact things all that much. So I would really, I really feel that's an important message for Christians in America today and the world over, is that it's our connection with God and knowing our own function. What is it that we're here to do? That is first and foremost, and we don't need to sit around and wait for any leader of any church to tell us everything to do.
That's perfect. That's awesome. Julie, let's do this again.
Okay, sure.
So I really liked it. All right, everybody. We'll talk to you next time. Hang out for just a few minutes too here, Julie.
Okay.